She didn't cry when she signed the papers. That was the part that surprised her most. Not the lawyer's voice, reading clause after clause into the stale conference room air. Not the way her husband of 7 years sat across from her, without once meeting her eyes. Not even the ring she'd already slipped off her finger that morning and left on the bathroom counter like a receipt she no longer needed. Genevieve Holt had always been the woman who cried at commercials. She cried at the end of old movies, at airport reunions she witnessed as a stranger, at the sound of children laughing in grocery stores for reasons she couldn't entirely explain. But the afternoon she signed her name on the line that ended her marriage, her eyes stayed dry. Her hand was steady. The pen barely made a sound. She told herself that meant she was strong. It would take months before she understood it meant something else entirely. The beginning, the way she told it later, wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no thrown dishes, no single night where everything fell apart at once. There was just Damon Holt, successful, charming, the kind of man who remembered waitresses' names and held doors open for strangers, slowly becoming someone she didn't recognize. And then, one Tuesday in October, she'd come home early from a work trip to find a woman named Priscilla Vane, sitting at Genevieve's kitchen island, wearing Genevieve's robe, drinking coffee from Genevieve's favorite mug. Priscilla didn't run. She didn't even stand up. She just looked at Genevieve with something almost like pity, tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, and said, "He told me you two were already done." Damon arrived home 40 minutes later to find Genevieve sitting in the same chair, waiting. He didn't deny it. He didn't grovel. He said, "I was going to tell you," in the same tone he used when he forgot to return a phone call. Then he said the marriage hadn't been working for a long time, which was true, and that he deserved to be happy, which was probably also true, and that Genevieve was too practical, too ambitious, too focused on her career to ever really be a wife. That last one she turned over in her mind for months. She still wasn't sure whether it was an insult or a compliment. She moved out the next morning. She took her laptop, her grandmother's quilt, and the coffee maker, because she'd bought it and she wasn't about to leave it behind. She left the ring. The divorce took 11 weeks. It was fast by any standard. No children, no custody dispute, a prenuptial agreement that divided things cleanly. Her lawyer, a brisk woman named Carol who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, said Genevieve was one of the most composed clients she'd ever had. Genevieve said thank you. She went home and ate cereal for dinner and watched a documentary about deep-sea creatures until she fell asleep on the couch. She told herself she was fine. She wasn't fine. But she was functional, and for a long time she confused the two. She had her work, which had always been the most reliable thing in her life. Genevieve ran the design division of a mid-sized architecture firm in Chicago, a job she'd spent 12 years building into something she was genuinely proud of. She had her apartment, which she'd found 3 weeks after leaving the marital home, and had slowly, deliberately made entirely her own. She had her sister, Bridget, who called every Sunday and brought soup and wine in equal measure, and who never once said she'd told her so, even though she had, 3 years into the marriage, when she'd quietly asked Genevieve if she was actually happy or just very good at appearing that way. What Genevieve didn't have was any sense of what came next. The months after the divorce moved strangely. Some days felt unbearably long. Others passed in a blur of meetings and late nights and takeout boxes she forgot to throw away. She ran in the mornings, sometimes too far, until her legs ached and her mind finally went quiet. She reorganized her bookshelves twice. She deleted and re-downloaded dating apps 4 times without ever sending a message. She didn't tell anyone about the nausea until she'd already convinced herself it was stress. It wasn't stress. She found out on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the papers were signed, in the bathroom of her own apartment at 7 in the morning, holding a test she'd bought the night before, almost as an afterthought. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time. Then she sat on the floor. The tile was cold through her pajamas, and she noticed that in a distant, irrelevant way. The same way, she noticed the tap dripping, the way the morning light came in at a particular angle under the door. She was 38 years old. She was newly divorced. She was completely alone. She was going to have a baby. She told Bridget first. Her sister cried, which surprised Genevieve, and then hugged her for a long time without saying anything, which didn't. "What are you going to do?" Bridget asked finally. "Have it?" Genevieve said, and realized as she said it that she'd already decided. Somewhere between the floor of the bathroom and right now, without ever consciously choosing. Okay, said Bridget. Then we figure it out. Genevieve did not tell Damon. She thought about it. She went back and forth, drafted the text a dozen times, imagined the conversation in excruciating detail. But every version ended the same way, with him inserting himself, or Priscilla inserting herself, or some drawn-out legal complication that would tie Genevieve to this man for the next 18 years. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Damon Holt, who had looked her in the eye after 7 years and said she was too practical to be a real wife, did not deserve to be the first call she made. So she made other calls instead. She found an OB she liked, a no-nonsense doctor named Yolanda, who had a daughter of her own and said things like, "Your body knows what it's doing," with enough conviction that Genevieve actually believed it. She told her firm's HR department that she would need to adjust her schedule in the coming months. She started reading, obsessively, the way she'd always handled uncertainty. Everything she could find about single motherhood, about infant development, about what it actually meant to raise a child alone. What she didn't expect was how lonely the pregnancy would feel. Not lonely in a dramatic way, not crying into the dark kind of lonely. Lonely in the ordinary sense, the way a meal for one feels different than a meal for two. The small accumulations of moments that were meant to be shared. The first ultrasound, when she heard the heartbeat and had to grip the table because she hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hold on to something. The night the baby kicked for the first time, hard enough to make her gasp, and she sat in her apartment with no one to reach for. She got good at being her own witness. She was 7 months pregnant when she met Fletcher Rowe. It wasn't romantic. Nothing about it was. She'd gone to a fundraiser for a children's hospital. Her firm donated every year, and she'd made it as far as the coat check before she realized she'd underestimated both the crowd and her own energy level. She was standing near the back of the room, calculating the exact minimum time she needed to stay to justify her attendance, when someone stepped back from the buffet table and collided directly into her. She caught herself against the wall. He turned around fast, already apologizing. "I'm so sorry I wasn't." He stopped. "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said, which was mostly true. "You didn't actually hit me." "Close enough." He looked genuinely alarmed, which she found faintly amusing. He was tall, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and he was wearing a suit that fit him the way suits fit people who don't have to think about suits. "Can I get you something? Water? A chair? I know there are chairs somewhere." "I'm fine," she said again, a little more warmly. "I'm Genevieve Fletcher." He offered his hand, then seemed to wonder if that was appropriate given what had just happened, and then shook it anyway. Fletcher Rowe, she knew the name. Most people in Chicago business circles did. Fletcher Rowe was the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself. No flashy profile features, no social media. Just a real estate development company that had quietly reshaped half the city's skyline over the past decade. He gave to causes he apparently didn't publicize. He showed up at fundraisers and stood near buffet tables and accidentally walked into pregnant women. He brought her water anyway because he seemed to need to do something useful. They ended up talking for 2 hours. She didn't think about it as anything significant after. She went home, took her shoes off, and fell asleep reading. But he called the next day. She still wasn't sure how he'd found her number, and when she asked him later, he said he had a very resourceful assistant, which turned out to be true, and asked if she'd like to have lunch sometime. "As friends," he said, which she appreciated for its directness. "I'm not. I realize the timing of this is questionable at best." "Questionable," she said, "is an interesting word for it. I just thought you seemed like someone worth knowing." She said yes to lunch, and then to another lunch, and then, gradually, to things that were not quite lunches. Walks along the lakefront, evenings on his rooftop terrace with takeout, and the city spread out below them, quiet hours in which she understood, slowly, that she hadn't really talked to anyone this honestly in years. He didn't pretend the situation was simple. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He never once made her feel like a project. She told him about Damon, about the robe and the coffee mug, and the way he'd said she was too practical. She told him about the night she'd found out she was pregnant and sat on the cold bathroom floor. She told him things she hadn't even told Bridget. He listened. He said at one point, quietly, "He was wrong about you, just so you know." She looked out at the lake and didn't answer. But something shifted, very slightly, in a part of her she'd thought had gone numb. The baby came on a Tuesday, 8 days ahead of schedule, which felt appropriate for a child who had already demonstrated a complete disregard for Genevieve's plans. Her name was Mara, 7 pounds 2 ounces, a shock of dark hair and an expression of profound indignation that Genevieve suspected she had inherited from her grandmother. She came into the world at 4:17 in the morning, while Bridget held Genevieve's hand, and the night nurses moved in their soft, efficient way around the room. And when they placed Mara on Genevieve's chest, the first thing Genevieve thought was not, "I love you," or "hello," or any of the things she'd imagined thinking. The first thing she thought was, "There you are." Like she'd been looking for something she hadn't known she'd lost. Fletcher came to the hospital the next morning. He stood in the doorway with flowers. Yellow, which was exactly right. She couldn't have explained why, and looked at Mara with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something unguarded. "She's incredible," he said. "She screamed for 40 minutes last night," Genevieve said, "and I still can't stop staring at her." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that reached his eyes, and she realized she'd been trying to make him laugh since she'd met him without knowing that's what she was doing. She'd been home with Mara for 3 weeks when Damon's name appeared on her phone. She knew she'd have to tell him eventually. She'd been aware of it, the way you're aware of a bill you haven't opened. Present, pressing, something you deal with when you're ready. But she hadn't been ready, and then Mara had arrived, and everything else had receded, and now his name was on her screen at 10 in the morning, and she understood that the window she'd had was closing. He found out from someone at their old gym, she learned later, a mutual acquaintance who'd seen Bridget at the hospital and put things together. Damon called 3 times that morning. She answered on the third. He was calm, initially. She'd give him that. He said he deserved to know. He said he had rights. He said the word rights 3 more times in the next 2 minutes, which told her most of what she needed to know about his approach to this situation. "I'd like to discuss this properly," she said, "through our respective attorneys." "You don't need to make this adversarial, Genevieve." "I didn't make it anything," she said. "I'm just clarifying how we're going to handle it." He showed up at her apartment that evening anyway. She didn't open the door. What came next was the part she hadn't anticipated. Not because Damon wanted the baby. She didn't believe he particularly did, but because Damon wanted control. He'd always wanted control, she understood now. And the marriage had given it to him in the comfortable, invisible way that power works when no one names it. Now she'd removed herself from his sphere and built something entirely new, and he couldn't tolerate that. His lawyer, a man named Whitfield, who wore pocket squares and had a reputation for being difficult, filed for a formal paternity establishment and immediately sought to challenge Genevieve's sole custody arrangement. He argued that Damon had been deliberately excluded, that Genevieve had made unilateral decisions about a child who was equally his, that the courts should ensure he had proper access. Carol, her lawyer, read the filing with the expression of someone who had seen this exact thing many times before. "He won't get what he's asking for," she said, "but he can make it take a while. How long depends on how hard he wants to push." Damon, it turned out, wanted to push fairly hard. The months that followed were the hardest Genevieve had ever lived through, which was saying something given the year she'd already had. She was nursing a newborn on 4 hours of sleep while reading legal documents at 2 in the morning. She was in depositions while Mara was with Bridget, coming home to pump, and then going back to work, and then coming home again to a baby who didn't know what a deposition was and required feeding anyway. She was holding it together by sheer mechanical repetition. Next task, next task, next task. Because falling apart wasn't an option when a 7-pound person depended on her for literally everything. Fletcher called every few days. Not to ask about the case. He seemed to understand instinctively that she didn't want to discuss it at length. But to check in, to ask about Mara, to tell her something he'd read or seen that had made him think of her. She told herself she wasn't leaning on him. She wasn't sure that was true. One evening, when Mara was almost 4 months old, and the latest court filing had made Genevieve's head ache in a specific way that only legal paperwork could, she said something she hadn't meant to say. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Not the baby, not Mara. The fight. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you trust your lawyer?" "Yes." "Then let her carry it. That's what you're paying her for." He paused. "What do you need tonight?" "Not tomorrow." "Tonight, I don't know," she said honestly. "I just needed someone to pick up the phone." "I picked up," he said. The turning point came from a direction she hadn't expected. 6 months into the custody dispute, Damon's own deposition revealed what Carol had already suspected. He had not been paying into the joint account they'd maintained during the marriage for the final 18 months before the divorce. The money had been diverted, not dramatically, not in any way that had triggered immediate flags, to accounts connected to a company in Priscilla Vane's name. It wasn't technically embezzlement. But it wasn't nothing either. More importantly, Carol's team, in the course of reviewing the divorce settlement documents, found something that had been buried in an appendix. A clause, written in language dense enough that most people would skim past it, in which Damon had agreed, in the original divorce agreement, that in the event of any children born within 12 months of the marriage's legal dissolution, he would defer to the primary parent's custody arrangement, pending a 2-year period of established relationship. Damon's own lawyer had apparently missed it, or, as Carol put it with a neutral expression that had communicated more than any editorial comment could have, apparently missed it. "What does that mean?" Genevieve asked. "It means," Carol said, sliding the document across the table, "that he already signed away his right to contest this. He just didn't notice." Genevieve looked at the clause. She looked at her lawyer. "His attorney never flagged this during the original signing," Carol said. "That's his problem, not yours." She read it twice. Then she set it down. "Is it enforceable? We're going to find out," Carol said. "But yes, I believe it is." It held. It took another 8 weeks, 2 more hearings, an emotion that Damon's attorney disputed with increasingly evident frustration, but it held. The judge's ruling was 14 pages. Genevieve read every word. Damon was granted supervised visitation pending the establishment of a meaningful relationship with Mara. Not the co-parenting arrangement he'd sought, not the legal leverage he'd tried to build. Supervised visits, documented, with a path toward more, if he chose to take it. Carol walked her out of the courthouse into a February afternoon so cold it made Genevieve's eyes water. Or maybe that was something else. She wasn't entirely sure. "Go home," Carol said. "Hold your daughter," she told Fletcher over the phone, standing on her balcony in a coat she hadn't bothered to button, looking out at the lake that was gray and enormous and indifferent to everything. "It's over," she said, "or the worst of it." He was quiet for a moment. She'd come to appreciate his silences the way he didn't rush to fill them. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said. Then, "Like something put down a weight I've been carrying for so long I forgot it wasn't part of me." "That sounds right," he said. She turned her face toward the wind. "I want to take Mara to the park tomorrow. If it's not too cold, I could come," he said. "If you wanted." She thought about that. The 3 of them in a park on a February afternoon, ordinary quiet, entirely without drama. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that." What Genevieve understood, much later, was that the story she'd been telling herself, about strength, about composure, about being fine, had missed the most important part. She hadn't been strong because she hadn't cried when she signed the papers. She'd been numb, and she'd mistaken numbness for resilience, which was a very common mistake, and also an exhausting one. What she'd actually been building across all of those months, through the cold bathroom floor and the first ultrasound and the late-night depositions and the evenings on Fletcher's rooftop, was something different, something slower and less impressive and more permanent, not the ability to endure without feeling, the ability to feel everything and keep going anyway. Mara was 11 months old the first time she laughed, really laughed, at something a pigeon did on the balcony railing, for reasons only she understood. It was a sound so sudden and so complete that it stopped Genevieve mid-sentence in a work call, and she sat there holding the phone with her hand, pressed flat against her sternum like she could hold on to the feeling. She told Fletcher about it that evening. He asked her to describe it, and she did, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something genuinely moved him, the careful way he held it, and she thought, "This is what I didn't know I was waiting for. Not rescue. Not someone to fix the years that had gone wrong. Just someone who asked her to describe the sound of her daughter laughing and actually wanted to know. Damon attended his first supervised visit on a Thursday in March. He was polite. He held Mara carefully, the way people hold babies when they're not sure of themselves. Mara regarded him with the same expression of detached assessment she gave to everyone new. Impartial, thorough, utterly without deference. And then reached for the button on his jacket with both hands and tried to eat it. Genevieve watched from across the room and felt nothing that surprised her. Not hatred, not sadness, just a clear-eyed awareness of who this man was, and who she was, and how little overlap remained between those two things. She drove home in the early afternoon light with Mara asleep in the back seat, and the city moved past the windows, and she thought about the woman who had sat in that conference room 11 months ago, dry-eyed, steady-handed, telling herself she was strong. She forgave her. That woman had been doing her best with what she knew. They all were. But Genevieve Holt, turning onto her street with the sun low and gold and her daughter breathing softly in the back, she was something better than strong now. She was whole.